The first time humanity stood before the Galactic Empire, it was meant to be a moment of trembling awe, the kind that lesser species recorded in reverent silence as they faced the oldest and most powerful civilization in known space. But instead, it became the moment the galaxy would later describe, with lingering confusion, as the incident where the newcomers laughed. The Imperial throne world was a spectacle engineered to dominate the psyche. A planet-spanning city of obsidian spires, orbiting rings glowing with artificial suns, and a palace so vast it could be seen from orbit, its halls lined with species that had bent the knee over millions of years. Every detail was deliberate, every shadow calculated to remind visitors of their insignificance. Humanity arrived in a single vessel, not massive, not adorned with intimidating weaponry, just a compact utilitarian ship that drifted into the Empire's docking cradle like it had somewhere better to be, which in truth it probably did. The delegation stepped out in simple uniforms, no ceremonial armor, no bioengineered enhancements on display, just a handful of representatives led by Ambassador Elena Voss, who took one look at the endless procession of kneeling envoys and whispered something to her team that caused a few suppressed snorts before they even reached the throne chamber. The Emperor, an ancient being augmented across millennia, their voice amplified through layers of technology and ritual, delivered the standard proclamation, a speech that had broken civilizations. Humanity was to submit, to integrate, to serve, or to be erased. It echoed across the chamber with such overwhelming force that the air itself seemed to vibrate, and for a brief moment the silence that followed held the weight of history itself. Then one of the human delegates, no one ever quite agreed who started it, let out a small, involuntary laugh. It wasn't mocking at first, more like the kind of surprised chuckle someone gives when they realize a situation is far more absurd than expected. But in the perfect acoustics of the throne chamber, it carried, bouncing off towering pillars and cascading upward into the vaulted ceiling. Every eye turned. The Emperor paused. The court froze. And then, against all logic, the laughter spread. Another human covered their mouth, shoulders shaking. A third outright doubled over. Within seconds, the entire human delegation was struggling to maintain composure, their attempts at restraint only making it worse, until Ambassador Voss herself finally gave up, wiped a tear from her eye and said, "Wait, sorry, just give us a second." Before turning away and laughing harder than the rest of them, the insult was beyond comprehension. No species had ever reacted this way, not even in secret. The Emperor demanded an explanation, their voice now edged with something dangerously close to anger. And when the humans finally managed to regain control, Voss straightened, still smiling, and said, "You're serious?" That single question rippled through the court more violently than any declaration of war. Humanity had spent centuries preparing for first contact, not by building monuments or rehearsing submission protocols, but by studying history, its own and the fragments of others it had intercepted, and what they saw in the Galactic Empire was not divinity or inevitability, but a pattern they knew all too well, an overextended power clinging to tradition, enforcing control through spectacle and fear, assuming that longevity equated to invincibility. To humans, it wasn't terrifying. It was familiar. It was the same arrogance that had preceded every empire on Earth's long and bloody timeline, dressed up in better technology but driven by the same predictable flaws. "You're doing the whole kneel or be destroyed speech," one of the delegates added, still grinning, like no one's ever tried that before. Another chimed in, "Do you have any idea how many of those we've had? We practically invented that routine." The court erupted, not in laughter but in outrage, confusion, disbelief, while the Emperor struggled to reconcile this response with every model of behavior they possessed. Species feared them, species revered them, species negotiated, resisted, or perished, but they did not laugh. Yet the humans weren't done. They began asking questions, pointed ones about resource allocation, governance structures, military logistics, and internal dissent, questions that no submissive civilization would ever dare to raise. And with each answer, their expressions shifted from amusement to something sharper, something almost analytical, like engineers examining a machine they had already decided was poorly built. "You've centralized authority this much?" Voss asked at one point. "Across how many systems? And you expect that to stay stable?" Another delegate muttered, "No redundancy, no adaptive governance. Wow, this is worse than we thought." To the Empire, it sounded like madness. To humanity, it was a diagnosis. The laughter hadn't been born from disrespect alone. It came from the sheer absurdity of facing a galactic superpower that had, in their view, made the same mistakes as every fallen empire before it, just on a larger scale. And when the Emperor, now seething, finally issued the inevitable threat of annihilation, the humans didn't flinch. Voss simply tilted her head and replied, "You can try. Others did." It wasn't bravado. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same casual tone as everything else that day, because humanity's history wasn't one of uninterrupted dominance. It was a story of constant conflict, adaptation, collapse, and rebuilding, of learning from failure in ways the Empire never had to. Where the Empire relied on tradition, humans thrived on change. Where the Empire demanded obedience, humans questioned everything. And where the Empire saw itself as eternal, humans understood, perhaps better than any species in the galaxy, that nothing was. The meeting ended without submission, without agreement, and without war, at least immediately. But the damage was done. Word spread across the stars, not just that a new species had defied the Empire, but that they had laughed in its face and walked away unbroken. At first it was dismissed as rumor, then as exaggeration, until recordings surfaced, clear, undeniable, proof of the moment the myth cracked. And in the quiet that followed, in the systems that had lived under imperial rule for generations, a dangerous idea began to take root. If the newcomers could laugh, maybe the Empire wasn't as invincible as it claimed. Humanity returned to its own space, still amused, still analyzing, already preparing for what might come next, because while the galaxy saw that day as an act of defiance, humans saw it as something far simpler. The moment they realized the biggest power in the universe wasn't a god to be feared, but just another empire waiting sooner or later to fall. The laughter did not end when humanity left the imperial throne world. It echoed, carried in recordings, whispers, and forbidden retellings across the countless systems under the Empire's rule. And for the first time in ages, doubt began to spread faster than fear. Imperial censors moved quickly, of course, seizing transmissions, purging archives, erasing any trace of the encounter. But suppression had never been a perfect science, and the more they tried to bury the story, the more it grew, mutating into something even more dangerous than the truth, because now it wasn't just about humans laughing. It was about why they had laughed, about what they had seen that no one else had dared to acknowledge. Within the Empire's inner circles, panic simmered beneath a veneer of absolute control as analysts tore apart every detail of the encounter, replaying the footage frame by frame, searching for hidden signals, covert technologies, anything that might explain the humans' behavior as strategy rather than genuine amusement. But the conclusion they arrived at was far more unsettling. The humans hadn't been afraid because they didn't perceive the Empire as unbeatable. That single realization forced the Empire to confront a possibility it had long dismissed, that its dominance was not a law of the universe, but a fragile equilibrium maintained by the belief of others. Meanwhile, humanity returned home and did what it always did best. It argued. Governments, coalitions, corporations, and independent factions debated the implications of the encounter, some urging caution, others advocating immediate resistance, and a few quietly suggesting that the Empire's weaknesses might present an unprecedented opportunity. Yet despite their disagreements, they shared a common understanding. The Empire would not forget this insult, and retaliation, in some form, was inevitable. Instead of panicking, humanity prepared, but not in the way the Empire expected. There were no grand displays of military might broadcast across the stars, no attempts to match the Empire's ship for ship or weapon for weapon, because humans had never been particularly good at winning through brute force alone. Instead, they adapted, diversified, and innovated, strengthening networks rather than hierarchies, building systems designed to bend without breaking, to function even when fractured. At the edges of imperial space, subtle changes began to occur. Minor trade disruptions that exposed logistical inefficiencies, small uprisings that spread faster than they should have, communication anomalies that bypassed long-standing control, protocols, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern that imperial strategists struggled to contain. They were used to crushing rebellions, not chasing ghosts. And then there were the messages, anonymous transmissions appearing in suppressed networks, encrypted channels, and even within the Empire's own infrastructure. Not overt calls to rebellion, but questions, simple and persistent. Why do they demand obedience? What happens if we refuse? Have they always been this strong, or have we always believed they were? The Empire tried to trace the origin of these messages, but they seemed to emerge from everywhere at once, like an idea that had outgrown its creators. Humanity never claimed responsibility, but they didn't need to. Back on Earth and its colonies, Ambassador Voss found herself at the center of a different kind of storm. Called before councils and assemblies to explain her actions, to justify the laughter that had shaken a galactic order, and when asked whether she regretted it, she gave the same answer every time. No, they needed to hear it. Not as an insult, but as a mirror. Because what humanity had seen in the Empire wasn't just weakness. It was stagnation, a system so accustomed to control that it had forgotten how to evolve, and in a universe that never stopped changing, that was a fatal flaw. The Empire, for all its power, had become predictable, and predictability was something humans had learned to exploit long ago. The first direct response came months later, when an Imperial fleet appeared at the edge of human-controlled space. Not in full force, but large enough to make a statement, a test, perhaps, or a warning. And for a brief moment the galaxy held its breath, expecting humanity to finally show fear, to scramble, to falter under the weight of impending conflict. Instead, the human response was strange. There was no single fleet rising to meet the Empire, no grand defensive line. Instead, the Imperial forces found themselves facing a constantly shifting landscape of resistance. Autonomous defense platforms appearing and disappearing, civilian vessels coordinating with military precision, communication networks rerouting. Faster than they could be disrupted, every attempt to assert control met with not direct opposition but fluid, adaptive interference. It was like trying to grasp water. The Empire struck where it could, destroying outposts, disabling stations, but each victory felt hollow because nothing critical seemed to break. Systems rerouted, populations relocated, operations continued, and the more the Empire pushed, the more it revealed the limits of its own approach. Their strength had always been overwhelming force applied to a fixed target, but humanity refused to remain fixed. Reports returned to the throne world filled with contradictions. The enemy does not consolidate. The enemy does not retreat in a conventional sense. The enemy adapts faster than projections allow. And underlying all of it, an unspoken concern. The humans did not behave like a species fighting for survival. They behaved like one testing hypotheses. As the conflict simmered, something even more troubling began to happen within the Empire itself. Those old questions, once whispered in the shadows, started to surface in places they shouldn't, among lower-ranked officials, among subjugated species, even within segments of the Imperial military. And though most were quickly silenced, the fact that they were being asked at all signaled a shift that no amount of force could fully suppress. The Empire could destroy ships, planets, even entire civilizations, but it struggled to destroy an idea, especially one that had been sparked by something as simple and as subversive as laughter. And through it all, humanity remained amused. Not careless, not unaware of the stakes, but quietly confident in a way that unnerved their adversaries, because they weren't trying to prove they were stronger than the Empire. They were proving that strength alone wasn't enough. The galaxy watched as the once unquestioned order began to strain under pressures it had never been designed to withstand. And in the growing cracks of that ancient structure, a new reality started to take shape, one where fear was no longer absolute, where obedience was no longer inevitable, and where the sound that had once been unthinkable in the presence of ultimate power began to spread. soft at first, then louder, until it became impossible to ignore. Laughter, not as mockery, alone, but as the first sign that the Empire's greatest weapon, its myth of invincibility, was finally beginning to fail.